Imagine the electric hum of Bengaluru's tech parks, not as they are today, but as they pulsed with an almost utopian energy 2 decades ago. The air was thick with the scent of ambition, of fresh code, and the promise of a future built on intellect. You saw young graduates, eyes bright with purpose, stepping into glass-fronted offices, believing they were not just building software, but an entirely new India, one powered by minds, not factories. This was the dawn of a global phenomenon, a nation shedding its old skin for the sleek, digital future. The narrative was simple. Education, hard work, and a command of English would unlock a prosperity previously unimaginable. It felt inevitable, a destiny unfolding with every successful IPO and every global contract. This vibrant, confident image wasn't merely a dream. It was a carefully constructed reality, a system that promised endless upward mobility. But what if that promise, so tangible then, was built upon an unseen fracture? Tell us in the comments, where are you watching this story unfold from? Your perspective connects us all. You are about to witness a narrative rarely told, an economic dissection that cuts through the dazzling statistics to expose a deeper truth. This isn't another story about isolated challenges or temporary setbacks. Instead, we will reveal how India's celebrated economic model, despite its impressive headline growth, was structurally designed to achieve statistical progress while simultaneously trapping vast segments of its population in low-income trajectories and pervasive underemployment. You will understand why widespread prosperity isn't an unfortunate side effect, but an inevitable consequence of foundational economic choices. Few speak of this openly because the alternative narrative is far more comfortable, far more flattering to those who champion aggregate numbers over human realities. But ignoring this truth carries a profound cost, one that ripples through generations and shapes the very fabric of a nation. This analysis is crucial because it challenges the very definition of success we are often sold. To truly grasp this unraveling, you must first understand the intoxicating allure of the system that came before. Since the pivotal post-liberalization reforms of the early 1990s, India was globally championed as the quintessential success story of the 21st century. It presented itself as a titan powered by immense scale, an unparalleled demographic dividend, and consistently high GDP growth. The dominant model was a service-led economy, deeply integrated into global supply chains through its burgeoning IT and BPO sectors. This path seemed inherently stable and inevitably prosperous. It consistently delivered impressive aggregate numbers, seemingly defying the traditional arduous path of industrialization. The implicit promise was clear. Rapid growth, regardless of its underlying composition, would inevitably translate into widespread prosperity, stable employment, and a rising standard of living for its vast population, making a robust manufacturing base seem almost optional. Millions invested their hopes and futures in this vision. If you seek clarity on complex global shifts that no one fully explains, subscribe now. We unravel the hidden mechanics. Meet Amit Kumar, a 28-year-old data analyst, navigating the bustling streets of Bengaluru each morning. He embodies the living promise and its emerging paradox. Hailing from a middle-class family in a Tier 2 city, Amit's parents poured their life savings into his engineering degree, a sacred investment in a future they believed was guaranteed. They instilled in him the deep-seated value of meritocracy, the unwavering belief that education and hard work would inevitably lead to upward mobility and financial security. Amit diligently followed this prescribed path. He excelled in school, secured his coveted engineering degree, and landed a job in the celebrated IT sector. He carries the quiet pride of contributing to a global firm, a tangible link to that new India. His expectations were simple: a secure career, home ownership, the ability to support his aging parents. He is you if you had played by all the rules. The first fracture in this seemingly perfect system wasn't a sudden crack, but a sustained policy orientation. Following the 1991 reforms, India consciously leaned into leveraging its English-speaking, educated workforce for the burgeoning global services market. This was a deliberate choice, viewed as a faster, less capital-intensive route to growth compared to the arduous path of broad-based industrialization. At the time, it seemed entirely rational, offering quick returns and global recognition. Who could argue with such immediate success? Yet, embedded within this seemingly brilliant strategy was a fundamental invisible error. The underlying assumption was that a service-led growth model could absorb the millions entering the workforce annually from a predominantly rural, low-skilled background, without a robust, labor-intensive manufacturing sector acting as a crucial bridge. It was a bet on a single engine, believing it could carry the weight of an entire nation's aspirations. This critical decision immediately sparked a dazzling display of economic fireworks. Rapid GDP growth surged, significant foreign investment poured into the tech sector, and a globally competitive IT industry emerged, cementing India's reputation as a rising economic power. This initial success created a small, highly skilled, and affluent formal sector that flourished conspicuously. This visible segment of prosperity reinforced the illusion of widespread opportunity, providing tangible proof that the new economic direction was not only viable but superior. For a generation, including Amit's parents, these immediate returns validated their belief in this path, solidifying the idea that India had found its unique, accelerated route to global prominence. The system, for a time, appeared to be working exactly as promised, masking the accumulating pressure beneath its shiny surface. It seemed like pure progress, until the sheer scale of demographic pressure began its relentless reveal. You saw the glint of ambition, the promise of a new economic dawn. But beneath the surface, a crucial choice was being cemented. The initial triumph of the service sector, with its quick returns and global accolades, inadvertently led to a sustained policy omission. Policymakers, dazzled by the digital boom, made a rational, almost inevitable decision. They failed to aggressively invest in a large-scale, labor-intensive manufacturing sector. It wasn't a malicious oversight, but a calculated bet, a silent assumption that the burgeoning service economy, or perhaps the sheer force of its demographic dividend, would naturally absorb the millions flocking into the workforce. This seemed modern, efficient, a shortcut past the smokestacks of traditional industrialization, promising growth without the grit. Yet, this decision, seemingly innocuous at the time, was planting the seeds of a profound structural imbalance, a hidden dependency that would slowly begin to corrode the very foundations of widespread prosperity. The immediate consequence of this strategic omission was a manufacturing sector that never truly blossomed to its full potential. While other nations meticulously built vast industrial complexes, India's factories remained comparatively small, less competitive, and, critically, unable to absorb the colossal wave of semi-skilled and low-skilled workers pouring out of rural areas and into the job market each year. This wasn't merely an economic statistic. It was a human bottleneck, a growing disconnect between the skills of the masses and the available opportunities. The implicit promise of the service-led model was that its success would somehow trickle down, creating a vibrant ecosystem of supporting industries. Instead, what emerged was a stark contrast. A gleaming, globally connected IT hub, towering over an underdeveloped industrial landscape, unable to provide the foundational, stable employment needed by a nation of its scale. This structural deficit birthed a massive missing middle in India's employment landscape. You had the high-skill, high-wage jobs in the formal tech sector, and then a vast, proliferating sea of informal, low-wage work. The crucial, stable, middle-income manufacturing jobs that once served as a ladder for millions in other developing economies simply weren't there on the scale required. Instead, the aspiring workforce found itself funneled into precarious roles, from gig economy delivery drivers to small-scale vendors, all operating without formal contracts, benefits, or any semblance of long-term security. This wasn't merely underemployment, it was a systemic trap, a quiet erosion of dignity and potential. The individual effort remained immense, but the structural avenues for converting that effort into sustained upward mobility were rapidly narrowing, setting the stage for a profound economic disillusionment. The human cost of this structural imbalance became devastatingly clear in the lives of millions. While Amit Kumar secured his coveted spot within the formal IT sector, many of his peers, equally diligent, equally educated, found themselves caught in this emerging economic quicksand. They too had invested years and resources into their education, only to find the promised land of opportunity had shrunk into a narrow strip of high-paying jobs, leaving the vast majority to scramble for scraps. These were not failures of individual effort, but consequences of a system that offered insufficient pathways to stable, dignified livelihoods. They were trapped in a cycle of precarious, low-wage work, unable to build stable careers, accumulate wealth, or escape the daily grind. The grand narrative of India's growth was now being quietly contradicted by the grim reality of its burgeoning informal sector. This unfolding crisis proves that seemingly correct decisions can breed profound, unforeseen consequences over time. What decisions in your country's past do you believe are shaping your present? Share your thoughts below, and subscribe to unravel more hidden mechanics shaping our world. Even for those like Amit, who had successfully navigated the narrow entry point into the formal sector, the cracks began to appear. He diligently performed his data analysis, contributing to the global firm, yet his wages remained stubbornly stagnant. The annual increments were meager, barely keeping pace with the soaring cost of living in Bengaluru, a city that epitomized India's digital success. The dream of homeownership, a cornerstone of middle-class aspiration, felt increasingly distant, a mirage receding with each passing year. He watched his parents, whose life savings had paved his path, grow older and the ability to support them comfortably. Once a certainty, became a source of gnawing anxiety. The system that had promised to reward his merit and hard work was now subtly, relentlessly failing to deliver on its most fundamental pledges. The career trajectory he had envisioned, a steady ascent mirroring the nation's own growth, was agonizingly slow. Promotions were scarce, requiring an almost superhuman effort to stand out in a sea of equally qualified, equally ambitious colleagues. Amit felt a creeping sense of structural injustice, a profound dissonance between the immense effort he invested and the increasingly meager rewards he received. The narrative of meritocracy, so deeply ingrained by his parents, now felt like a cruel irony. He had played by all the rules, excelled in every exam, secured the right job, yet the future his parents had guaranteed, the future he had worked so hard for, was dissolving before his eyes. This was not a personal failing, but a systemic betrayal, hinting at forces far larger than any individual's control. You might wonder how a nation with such impressive GDP growth could harbor such widespread economic precarity. This is precisely the paradox Amit lived daily. He would see headlines trumpeting India's economic might, its rising global stature, and the continuous influx of foreign investment. Yet, these aggregate numbers, detached from the lived experience of the majority, felt increasingly hollow to him. His personal reality, stagnant wages, delayed milestones, the struggle to save, stood in stark contrast to the triumphant national narrative. This widening chasm between macroeconomic statistics and micro-level human experience wasn't a temporary blip. It was the inevitable outcome of foundational economic choices that prioritized statistical progress over comprehensive, equitable job creation. The system was now clearly failing to deliver on its implicit promise of shared prosperity. This wasn't a problem of individual ambition or a temporary economic downturn. What Amit, and millions like him, were experiencing was the silent rupture of a grand economic design. The system, once heralded as a pathway to unparalleled prosperity, was no longer delivering on its core promise for the vast majority. The initial, rational decision to lean into services had, over decades, created an intricate web of dependencies and omissions that now choked broad-based opportunity. The tension you feel building, the sense of unease, is the realization that this isn't an isolated challenge. It is the structural design of an economy, unfolding its predetermined consequences, revealing that the celebrated model was not just flawed, but built upon an inherent, unaddressed fragility that promised much, but delivered prosperity only to a select few. The strategic omission wasn't a malicious act, but a calculated bet, a silent assumption. Policymakers, mesmerized by the digital boom's immediate returns, failed to aggressively invest in a large-scale, labor-intensive manufacturing sector. This decision, seemingly rational at the time, was underpinned by the belief that the burgeoning service economy, or the sheer force of its demographic dividend, would naturally absorb the millions flocking into the workforce. Yet, this shortcut past traditional industrialization planted the seeds of a profound structural imbalance. The immediate effect was a manufacturing sector that never truly blossomed, remaining comparatively small and less competitive. It was critically unable to absorb the colossal wave of semi-skilled and low-skilled workers pouring out of rural areas and into the job market each year. This wasn't merely an economic statistic, it was a human bottleneck, a growing disconnect between the skills of the masses and the available opportunities, quietly setting the stage for an unseen struggle. This structural deficit, a gaping hole where a vibrant industrial middle should have been, birthed a massive missing middle in India's employment landscape. You had the high-skill, high-wage jobs in the formal tech sector, a glittering spire of prosperity, and then a vast, proliferating sea of informal, low-wage work at its base. The crucial, stable, middle-income manufacturing jobs that once served as a robust ladder for millions in other developing economies simply weren't there on the scale required to uplift a nation of this size. Instead, the aspiring workforce found itself funneled into precarious roles, from gig economy delivery drivers to small-scale vendors, all operating without formal contracts, benefits, or any semblance of long-term security. This wasn't merely underemployment, it was a systemic trap, a quiet erosion of dignity and potential. Individual effort remained immense, but the structural avenues for converting that effort into sustained upward mobility were rapidly narrowing, setting the stage for profound economic disillusionment. Even for those like Amit, who had successfully navigated the narrow entry point into the formal sector, the cracks began to appear, subtle at first, then widening into undeniable chasms. He diligently performed his data analysis, contributing to the global firm, yet his wages remained stubbornly stagnant. The annual increments were meager, barely keeping pace with the soaring cost of living in Bengaluru, a city that epitomized India's digital success but also its economic disparity. The dream of home ownership, a cornerstone of middle-class aspiration, felt increasingly distant, a mirage receding with each passing year. He watched his parents, whose life savings had paved his path with such sacrifice, grow older, and the ability to support them comfortably, once a certainty, became a source of gnawing anxiety. The system that had promised to reward his merit and hard work was now subtly, relentlessly, failing to deliver on its most fundamental pledges, leaving him adrift in a sea of unfulfilled expectations. The career trajectory he had envisioned, a steady ascent mirroring the nation's own proclaimed growth, was agonizingly slow, if it moved at all. Promotions were scarce, requiring an almost superhuman effort, an impossible degree of exceptionalism, to stand out in a sea of equally qualified, equally ambitious colleagues. Amit felt a creeping sense of structural injustice, a profound dissonance between the immense effort he invested daily and the increasingly meager rewards he received. The narrative of meritocracy, so deeply ingrained by his parents through years of sacrifice and belief, now felt like a cruel irony, a hollow promise echoing in the sterile corridors of his office. He had played by all the rules, excelled in every exam, secured the right job, yet the secure future his parents had guaranteed, the future he had worked so hard for, was dissolving before his eyes. This was not a personal failing, not a lack of effort, but a systemic betrayal, hinting at forces far larger than any individual's control, forces he couldn't name but could viscerally feel. You might wonder how a nation with such impressive GDP growth could harbor such widespread economic precarity. This is precisely the paradox Amit lived daily, a stark contradiction between official narratives and lived realities. He would see headlines trumpeting India's economic might, its rising global stature, and the continuous influx of foreign investment. Yet, these aggregate numbers, detached from the lived experience of the majority, felt increasingly hollow to him. His personal reality, stagnant wages, delayed milestones, the struggle to save, stood in stark contrast to the triumphant national narrative. This widening chasm between macroeconomic statistics and micro-level human experience wasn't a temporary blip. It was the inevitable outcome of foundational economic choices that prioritized statistical progress over comprehensive, equitable job creation. The system, shaped by the antagonists of incomplete industrialization and the dual economy, was now clearly failing to deliver on its implicit promise of shared prosperity. If you seek clarity on complex global shifts that no one fully explains, subscribe now. We unravel the hidden mechanics, revealing the true cost of these unseen forces. This wasn't a problem of individual ambition or a temporary economic downturn. This was the consequence of a systemic decision. Continued reliance on a large, cheap labor pool and an almost singular focus on cost arbitrage within certain service sectors. This strategic orientation, while initially boosting competitiveness, exerted a relentless downward pressure on real wages across many sectors, even for educated professionals like Amit. The immediate effect was a subtle but pervasive stagnation of real incomes for the majority, a quiet erosion of purchasing power. This widening wealth inequality, in turn, placed immense pressure on already strained public services, housing, transport, sanitation, which simply could not keep pace with rapid urbanization and population growth. Without an adequate formal tax base to fund these essential services, the quality of life for millions began to visibly decline, trapping them further in a cycle of limited opportunity. The celebrated growth was becoming a gilded cage for many. The accumulated effect of these intertwined decisions was a growing frustration and a profound disillusionment among the youth, particularly those like Amit, who diligently followed the prescribed path. They had been told that education and hard work were the keys to a better life, a guarantee of upward mobility. Yet, they found the promised rewards increasingly elusive, replaced by stagnant wages and a future defined by precarity. This wasn't merely a personal setback, it was a profound sense of structural betrayal. The system, once heralded as a pathway to unparalleled prosperity, was no longer delivering on its core promise for the vast majority. The initial, rational decision to lean into services had, over decades, created an intricate web of dependencies and omissions that now choked broad-based opportunity, proving that even seemingly sound economic strategies can breed unintended, devastating consequences when left unchecked. The tension you feel building, the sense of unease, is the realization that this isn't an isolated challenge. This creeping disillusionment converged into a single, critical decision point, one that solidified the crisis into something irreversible. It was India's sustained failure, spanning decades, to pivot towards a dual-engine growth strategy that robustly integrated large-scale manufacturing and formal job creation alongside its successful service sector. Imagine a fork in the road, where one path led to balanced inclusive growth and the other to a glittering but ultimately narrow prosperity. An aggressive, state-led industrial policy, perhaps with protective tariffs for nascent industries and massive investment in vocational training tailored for manufacturing, similar to East Asian tigers, was the unchosen path. This robust alternative, however, was not pursued. The immediate gratification of service-led GDP growth, the daunting capital requirements, and the sheer complexities of building a manufacturing base from scratch, combined with a political economy that prioritized visible, short-term successes in the tech sector, overshadowed the slower, more arduous task of mass industrialization. This was the moment of no return, where the nation committed to a trajectory with profound, inevitable consequences. The lost opportunity cost of this unchosen path is immeasurable. A phantom economy of millions of stable, middle-income jobs that would have built a robust domestic consumer base and a more resilient, equitable economy. From this point, the options became acutely limited, like a river diverted, its original course now dry and impassable. The sheer scale of the demographic dividend, that immense wave of young people now entering the workforce, combined with relentless global shifts towards automation, meant India had missed its primary window to industrialize labor intensively. The crucial historical moment for creating mass employment through manufacturing had passed, leaving a void that could not be easily filled. The current structural imbalances are now deeply entrenched, making comprehensive reform not a simple policy adjustment, but a generational challenge, a monumental task requiring a fundamental re-engineering of the economic landscape, an almost impossible feat against the backdrop of global competition and entrenched interests. The consequences of these foundational choices, these sustained omissions, are not theoretical debates confined to economic papers. They are etched into the daily lives of millions, from the stagnant wages of a data analyst in Bengaluru to the precarious existence of a gig worker in Mumbai. What you are witnessing is the unfolding of a predetermined outcome, the inevitable consequence of a system that prioritized statistical progress over genuine human development. The celebrated model was not just flawed, it was built upon an inherent, unaddressed fragility that promised much, but delivered prosperity only to a select few. The structural design of this economy, now fully revealed, has locked vast segments of its population into a low-income trap, a cycle of underemployment that is difficult to escape. The next step is to understand how this reality is validated by undeniable facts, proving that this narrative is not conjecture, but a grim, observable truth. The narrative of India's economic triumph, so often broadcast globally, crumbles under the weight of its own official data, revealing a stark, uncomfortable truth. You see consistently high GDP growth rates, figures that dazzle and impress on paper. Yet these statistics exist alongside alarmingly high rates of youth unemployment, especially among educated graduates like Amit. This isn't a minor discrepancy, it's a gaping chasm. The celebrated growth fails to create sufficient formal jobs, pushing millions into a persistently dominant informal sector that accounts for over 80% of all employment. This is where the majority of the population struggles, without contracts, benefits, or security, trapped in a cycle of underemployment that statistical aggregates conveniently overlook. The numbers, therefore, are not a testament to shared prosperity, but a silent indictment of a system built on a fragile foundation. This structural flaw manifests further in a profound paradox. Major companies, desperate for skilled labor in advanced manufacturing sectors, often find a critical shortage, even as millions of educated yet underemployed graduates struggle to find dignified work. It is a fundamental mismatch, a system unable to connect its workforce with its industrial needs. What follows is an undeniable brain drain, a quiet exodus of India's brightest and most ambitious. Talented professionals, much like Amit in their aspirations, are emigrating in unprecedented numbers to Western countries. Their motivation isn't merely higher pay, it's a desperate search for stable career progression, predictable economic futures, and the promise of meritocracy that their homeland has failed to deliver. This migration is not a choice of luxury, but often a necessity, a vote of no confidence in their own nation's economic structure. Further validating this structural imbalance, numerous studies consistently reveal stagnant real wages for the vast majority of the population. This isn't a temporary dip, it's a persistent, insidious erosion of purchasing power that fuels a widening wealth gap, creating a society of stark economic contrasts. While a select few accumulate immense riches, the masses find their daily struggle intensified, their aspirations deferred. Concurrently, the public services and infrastructure in rapidly urbanizing areas, the very engines of the new India, are visibly overstretched. They buckle under the relentless influx of migrants, all seeking the scarce opportunities that never materialize on a broad scale. From congested transport to inadequate sanitation, these ground-level realities visibly demonstrate the profound disparity between the triumphant aggregate growth figures and the lived experience of millions. These aren't isolated anecdotes or unfortunate coincidences. They are the verifiable, undeniable proofs of our central thesis. The high GDP numbers, the gleaming tech hubs, the international acclaim, these are all true, yet they coexist with, and in many ways contribute to, a system structurally designed to achieve statistical progress while simultaneously trapping vast segments of its population in low-income trajectories and pervasive underemployment. The widespread lack of broad-based prosperity isn't an accidental oversight. It is an inevitable consequence of foundational economic choices that prioritized service-led expansion over comprehensive industrialization and equitable job creation. You are not witnessing a temporary challenge, but the logical unfolding of a deeply embedded structural fragility, now exposed for all to see. If understanding the true cost of economic narratives, the hidden forces shaping nations, and the patterns that repeat across the globe is crucial to you, then subscribe now. We cut through the noise, explaining the next unfolding developments and connecting the dots no one else dares to touch. If this trajectory remains unchecked, if these foundational economic choices persist, the long-term consequences are not merely concerning, but profoundly systemic and devastating. The low-income trap will cease to be an abstract concept and will solidify into an intergenerational reality for vast segments of the population. Imagine entire families, for generations, locked into a cycle of precarious work and limited opportunity, where upward mobility becomes a myth rather than a promise. This economic stagnation will inevitably exacerbate social divisions, sharpening the lines between the few who prosper and the many who struggle. The resulting frustration and despair will not remain silent, potentially leading to increased social unrest, a volatile undercurrent beneath the surface of a seemingly growing nation. Furthermore, India's grand ambition to become a global economic and geopolitical superpower will be severely constrained, if not entirely undermined, by a large, restless, and chronically underemployed youth population. This demographic dividend, once hailed as its greatest asset, risks becoming its greatest liability, weakening its potential as a reliable alternative in global supply chains. The absence of robust domestic demand, stemming from a broad, thriving middle class, will inherently limit the economy's intrinsic growth potential, perpetuating an over-reliance on exports or a narrow consumer base, making it vulnerable to external shocks. Meanwhile, immense pressure on urban centers, coupled with inadequate infrastructure and environmental safeguards, will inevitably lead to unsustainable urbanization, resource depletion, and a severe decline in the quality of life for millions, irrevocably transforming the nation's social fabric. India's economic narrative, therefore, stands as a potent, global cautionary tale, a lesson etched in the lives of millions. While national statistics can paint an alluring picture of soaring growth and undeniable progress, True, sustainable national prosperity and genuine stability are inextricably linked to an economic structure that doesn't just grow, but genuinely absorbs, empowers, and uplifts its entire populace. It must be a system that works for everyone, not merely a select few, ensuring that the fruits of development are broadly shared. This story reveals that prioritizing headline GDP figures, those impressive but often superficial numbers, without building a foundational industrial base and equitable job creation, is a systemic choice with profound, inevitable consequences. This profound journey through India's economic choices demonstrates that genuine advancement for any developing nation is paved not just with technological innovation or abstract policy, but with concrete, inclusive opportunity that reaches every citizen. It demands a critical reevaluation of what truly constitutes economic success, moving beyond the dazzling but often misleading statistical triumphs. True prosperity, you now understand, is about more than just numbers. It is about human dignity, stable livelihoods, and the ability for every individual, like Amit, to realize their potential and build a secure future. The path to a truly prosperous future, therefore, is one where economic growth translates directly into a better life for all. A system where the promise of meritocracy is not an empty echo in the corridors of power, but a lived reality, a tangible certainty for every single citizen, from the bustling cities to the quietest villages.